I lost £163,000 to a beach resort that never existed, run by a woman who vanished on a Thursday morning and whose phone number stopped working by Thursday afternoon. £163,000 across 7 separate transfers over 8 months. To a company registered to an address in Phuket that, when I finally went to find it, turned out to be a car wash on a side road behind the Kamala night market, with no connection to any resort development of any kind. But you have to understand, and I know that's exactly what someone who got conned always says, but you have to understand, this was not a simple scam. This was a complete, detailed, professional-grade investment prospectus with photographs and cash flow projections, and a company registration number, and a lawyer's letter on headed paper, and everything I would have needed to see if I had been the kind of man who was looking for reasons not to believe in something. And I was not that man. Not in Phuket. Not after what had happened in Manchester. Not when someone was finally showing me a way forward instead of another door closing. My name is Vincent. I am 60 years old. Before I tell you about Thailand, I need to tell you about the pub, because the pub is the reason everything in Thailand happened the way it happened. I had run a pub in Salford for 11 years. Not a destination pub. Not a gastropub with craft beer and chalkboard menus. A real pub. A local pub. The kind of place where people came because they had always come, and where the regulars knew each other's names, and family situations, and the particular combination of drinks that got each of them through whatever that week had been. I loved that pub. I was good at running it. I built a loyal trade, kept the staff turnover low, maintained the premises properly, and for 8 of those 11 years, turned a decent enough profit to support myself and pay down the lease and save a modest amount each year that was earmarked, in my mind, as the foundation of whatever came next. What came next was the pandemic, then the rent review, then 2 suppliers who went under in the same quarter and left me carrying stock costs I had not budgeted for, then a VAT demand from HMRC that arrived at exactly the moment my cash reserve had been depleted by the supplier crisis. Then the kind of compound financial pressure that does not kill a business all at once, but applies itself in accumulating increments until one morning you look at the accounts and understand that the numbers do not work and are not going to work, and that you have a choice between continuing for another 3 months while the hole gets deeper, or stopping now and salvaging what you can. I stopped. The insolvency process took 14 months. When it was done, I had £210,000 remaining, which was the residue of the pub's fixtures and the lease transfer, and a small amount I had managed to sequester in a personal account that the insolvency practitioners confirmed was outside the scope of the proceedings. £210,000 after 11 years of work. It felt like holding a handful of water. My sister Karen, in her specific way, said, "Come and stay with us for a bit." My ex-wife, who I had been separated from for 6 years by that point, said nothing, because we were not in contact. The friends from the pub had their own lives and their own problems, the kind that multiply in Salford during a recession, and the social network that the pub had maintained for me dissolved in the way that venue-based social networks always dissolve when the venue is no longer there. I was 59 years old, I had £210,000, and I had no idea what to do with either of those facts. So I did what people in that situation do when they have just enough money to do it. I booked a flight somewhere warm and told myself I was taking a holiday to clear my head. Thailand was the destination because a man I knew from the pub, a retired electrician named Graham who had spent a month in Phuket 5 years earlier, had talked about it often enough in the context of what you could do with money out there that the idea had lodged in my head. Not romance, not lifestyle, not escape, business. What you could get for your money. The pub industry in the UK had been my entire adult professional life, and the pub industry in the UK was, in my direct experience, an absolute meat grinder for your capital. And the idea of a place where the same capital could buy you something with more room in it, more margin, more possibility, less HMRC correspondence, had a practical appeal that was not about the beaches or the temples, or any of the things people usually say about Thailand. I was not going for a holiday. I was going to look at what was possible. Phuket in October is just past the rainy season. The roads are still wet dark in the mornings, and the vegetation is the specific saturated green of somewhere that has been well rained on. And the beaches on the western coast are rough and dramatic, in a way that is more interesting to me than the postcard calm of the dry season. I had booked a guest house in Kamala, which is a village on Phuket's western coast north of Patong, quieter than Patong, more residential. A place where people actually lived rather than just passed through on their way to nightclubs. The guest house was small and clean, and the woman at the front desk spoke excellent English and had a laminated folder of local business information that she offered to guests who asked, which I did on the second morning. Her name was Cream. She was 27, efficient, with a specific kind of composed professionalism that I associated with people who had been trained in hospitality rather than who had simply ended up in it. She answered my questions about the local business landscape with the precision of someone who had thought about these questions before, or who found them genuinely interesting. When I asked about investment opportunities in the Phuket hospitality sector, because I asked, I initiated this, she did not push anything at me. She said she happened to know of a development project in the Kamala area that was looking for investment partners. She said this carefully, without pressure, and offered to get me some information if I was interested. I said I was interested, but you have to understand. I know. I was not naive about investment due diligence. I had run a business. I understood cash flow projections. I understood occupancy rate assumptions. I understood the difference between a glossy presentation and a viable business model. When the folder arrived at the guest house reception 2 days later, 12 pages, professionally printed, with photographs of the plot, architectural renders of the proposed boutique resort, projected occupancy rates, a 5-year revenue model, the company registration documentation, the land title records, the name and contact details of a law firm in Phuket town. I read it the way I had read supplier proposals and lease documents in the pub business, critically, with my former publican's nose for something that did not add up. I could not find what did not add up. That is the honest truth. The documents looked right. The registration number was real. I checked it online, and it returned a company record. The projected returns were aggressive, but not absurdly so, in a sector that was genuinely recovering post-pandemic on a timeline that the actual tourism data I looked up appeared to support. The asking investment for a founding partner stake was 4.5 million baht, which at the October exchange rate was approximately £96,000. For a 30% equity stake in a development that the prospectus valued at 25 million baht on completion. The numbers made sense. That is the thing I cannot get past even now. The numbers made sense. I met Cream for coffee 3 days after the folder arrived. This was November. I had extended my stay without really making a conscious decision to extend it. Just kept not booking the return flight. We talked about the project for 2 hours. She knew it in detail. She knew the land vendor, the construction company, the architect, the projected timeline. She knew the hospitality market in that part of Phuket with a specificity that came from living there, not from reading reports. She was not selling me. That is the distinction I keep returning to. She was answering my questions, and my questions were good questions, and her answers were consistent and detailed, and she pulled out her phone twice to show me things she was referencing rather than just asserting, which in my experience of people who are trying to sell you something is not what they do. I went back to the UK in December. I told Graham about the project over a pint in Salford, and Graham, who had been to Phuket and had some residual sense of the property market there, said, "Sounds interesting, Vince. Just get a local lawyer to check the documents." I said I would. I did not at that point, and I want to be honest about why. Because getting a local lawyer involved felt like the act of someone who did not trust the situation, and I trusted the situation. And not trusting things had cost me the pub by making me slow to act when I should have moved, and I was not going to make that mistake again. This is the sunk cost mentality that the description of my character so accurately names. I had already lost so much that caution felt like a second loss, and I could not afford a second loss, and so I made the decision to act. I transferred £96,000 in January. The company banking details were in the prospectus. The transfer went through cleanly. Cream sent a confirmation email within 2 hours, with an investment agreement attached. signed by the company director, stamped, professional. She sent a second email a week later, with a construction timeline and the name of the site foreman, and a photograph of the plot with survey markers in the ground. I had the photograph on my phone for months. I still have it. I do not know whose plot it is. By March, I was back in Phuket, staying in a rented room in Rawai, on the south of the island this time. Not at Cream's guest house. I had moved to something cheaper since I was planning to be there for a longer stretch. I visited the plot twice with Cream. It was real land, a cleared site with survey markers, and what appeared to be the beginning of a foundation, and standing on it in March, with the Andaman Sea, visible in the distance between two hills, and the construction equipment parked at one edge of the site, I felt, despite everything I had been through in Salford, the specific relief of something beginning, something that was mine, or partly mine, in a place where the numbers were different and the possibilities were different, and nobody knew about the pub, or the insolvency, or the VAT demand. The project needed more capital in April. This is the part of the story I find hardest to tell, not because it was the worst part, but because it was the most avoidable, and I did not avoid it. The construction company had revised the foundation costs. Cream explained this with documents I did not read carefully enough, in retrospect, because they were in Thai with an English summary that I accepted as equivalent. And the shortfall required an additional 2.1 million baht from the investment partners, divided proportionally. My share of the additional requirement was £45,000. Cream presented this as a standard development variance, the kind that happens in any construction project, and she was right that it happens in any construction project, and I transferred the £45,000 in April. In May, there was a planning approval issue. This is the thing I should have stopped at, and I know it. And I am telling you this not as an excuse, but as the specific mechanism because I think it matters. A planning approval issue sounds serious, but Cream explained it as administrative. The local authority had required additional environmental documentation that the architect was preparing, a standard requirement, a 6-week delay at most. The delay meant the construction company was holding equipment idle and was threatening to demobilize to another project, which would cost substantially more to remobilize than keeping them on site during the delay. The additional cost to hold the construction contract in place was 1.1 million baht split between partners. My share was £22,000. I transferred it in May. I had now put in £163,000. This is the number that matters, not the original £96,000. The total, £163,000, because by May, I was not making investment decisions anymore. I was making sunk cost decisions. The difference is this: an investment decision asks whether the expected future return justifies the capital committed. A sunk cost decision asks whether you can psychologically accept having already lost what you have already committed, and concludes that you cannot, and commits more money to avoid confronting the original loss. I had been through the pub. I had been through the insolvency. I could not be the man who had lost the pub and lost his investment in Thailand. I could not carry both of those things. So I paid the £22,000 in May, and I told myself it was a sensible business decision, and I was lying to myself in the specific way that financial desperation permits. And then she said the business needed £50,000 more, and something in me finally, at last, could not do it. I do not know whether it was the size of the number or the timing or some specific quality in the way Cream presented the request. She called this time rather than emailed, which was unusual. But when she said the development required a further capital injection of approximately £50,000 and that it needed to be in place within 2 weeks, or the construction contract would be terminated, I sat in the rented room in Rawai and I felt something I had not felt since the beginning of the project. I felt the request land differently, like it had a weight that the previous requests had not had. I said I needed to think about it. I said I would call her back in the morning. That evening, I wrote to an expat forum I had found through a Facebook group for British residents in Phuket. I described the project in general terms, the structure, the timeline, the additional capital requests, and asked whether this sounded familiar to anyone with experience of development investment in the area. The thread sat quiet for 6 hours. Then, at 11 o'clock that evening, a private message arrived from a username I did not recognize. The message said, "I need to speak to you. I was in this exact same situation 18 months ago. It was not a real project. Call me." I called the number in the message. The man who answered was a Dutchman named Paul who had been living in Chiang Mai for 3 years and who had, 18 months before my situation, invested 3.8 million baht, approximately 86,000 pounds at the exchange rate at the time, in a boutique resort development in the Kamala area of Phuket, presented by a woman he described. When he started describing her, I held the phone tighter. He described her age, her manner, her professionalism, the quality of the documents, the construction site visits, the sequential additional capital requests for foundation costs and planning delays. He had invested his total and then been presented with a final large request, at which point he had also, as he put it, felt the request land differently. He had investigated. He had found a Thai lawyer named Kun Thaksin in Phuket town, who specialized in investment fraud cases. By the time he reached a lawyer, the woman he had dealt with had gone and could not be contacted. The address on the company documents was a car wash on a side road behind the Kamala night market. I want to describe what it felt like to hear this information, because I have been asked, and I think the description matters. It did not feel like being punched. It felt like something I had been half expecting finally being said aloud. There was a quality of recognition in it, the specific recognition of something you have been carrying as a formless anxiety that suddenly has precise edges and a name. I sat in the rented room in Rawai, and I listened to Paul describe my own situation 18 months in advance, and I felt what I can only describe as a terrible clarity. Clean and cold and absolute. I called Cream the following morning. The number rang 8 times and went to voicemail. I sent a WhatsApp message. It showed 2 ticks and then, while I was watching the screen, showed a single tick. She had blocked me. I tried a different number I had for her from earlier in the correspondence. Disconnected. I went to the guest house in Kamala by taxi. It took 45 minutes. And a different young woman was at the front desk and had no knowledge of anyone named Cream and had been at the guest house for 6 weeks and knew nothing of any previous staff. The manager, a Thai man in his 50s who spoke limited English, looked at the photograph on my phone and shook his head and would not say anything further. I called Kun Thaksin, Paul's lawyer, that afternoon. I was in a cafe near the guest house when I made the call, and I remember that there was a football match on the television in the corner of the cafe that I kept looking at while I was on the phone because my eyes did not know where to go. And I remember the specific smell of the coffee that went cold in the cup in front of me while Kun Thaksin spoke. He had seen this structure before, not from Cream specifically. He could not establish a connection between the case Paul had described and my situation, though the modus operandi was identical. He explained the company registration, real, registered, but the registered address was not what I had been shown, and the director listed on the company documents was a name with no traceable identity, almost certainly nominal. The land I had visited, the plot with the survey markers, was real land, but was not in any way connected to the company I had invested in. It was, as far as Kun Thaksin could establish, a different development entirely that happened to be at a publicly visible construction stage in the right area. They had taken me to look at someone else's project and presented it as their own. I sat in the cafe long after the coffee was cold, and long after the football match had ended, and long after the cafe had started to fill up for lunch, and I went through the full accounting in my head, which was the worst kind of accounting. Not pages and figures, but the memory of each decision and what I had been thinking when I made it. January, 96,000 pounds, the founding investment, the one I had done proper research on and still got wrong. April, 45,000 pounds, the foundation variance. May, 22,000 pounds, the planning delay. The total, 163,000 pounds. 77% of the money I had walked away from the pub insolvency with. Every pound of it transferred voluntarily to a real bank account attached to a real company registration, with documentation I had checked and found consistent, by a woman who had disappeared into Thailand like water into sand. The manic phase began that afternoon, if I am honest about it. I am going to call it what it was, because I think naming it accurately is the only useful thing I can do with it. I made a list of every action I was going to take. I was going to file a police report. I was going to hire a private investigator. I was going to contact Interpol. I was going to go back through every email and identify every IP address. I was going to find Paul's lawyer and get him to engage his entire network to locate Cream's identity. I was going to post on every expat forum in Thailand with a description and a warning. I was going to get the story to the British Embassy, to the Thai Consumer Protection Board, to the Thai Tourism Authority. I was going to pursue this across every available channel simultaneously, with the specific energy of a man who has been comprehensively wronged, and who finds, in the anger, a clarity of purpose that the preceding months had been slowly eroding. Kun Thaksin, who I met in person 2 days later in his office in Phuket town, was patient and thorough. He told me to file the police report, which I did. He told me the private investigator was unlikely to produce results, because the identity documentation used in these schemes was designed to be untraceable, but he would make inquiries. He told me the company bank account had been closed 3 days before I attempted to call Cream, which confirmed that the timeline had been planned and that the final £50,000 request had likely been the intended final extraction before the exit. The fact that I had not paid it was irrelevant to my loss, but was notable. It meant I had, without realizing it, refused the final payment at the last possible moment. Whether that was instinct or luck, or the specific intervention of Paul's message from Chiang Mai, I could not say. The police report was filed. The investigation was opened and progressed at the pace of Thai criminal proceedings, involving a fraudster with no fixed address and a company registered to a nom de plume. I called Karen from Phuket town at 8 in the evening on a Thursday, which was 9 in the evening in Manchester, and I told her what had happened in the specific flat way that you tell people things when you have already processed them, as far as you can process them alone. Karen said, "Come home, Vince." I said I did not know if I could come home. Not financially, I meant emotionally. Coming home meant arriving back in Salford with the pub gone and the Thailand money gone, and nothing left but the £47,000 that remained in my UK account, which was the only portion of the £210,000 I had kept back and had not touched. Coming home meant being 60 years old and starting from numbers I had not seen since my 30s, in a country whose business landscape I already knew had no room for me in the way I wanted to be in it. Karen said, "You can come home and be angry here. You don't have to sort it out in Thailand." That landed. I did not go home immediately. I stayed another 3 weeks, attending to the police report follow-up and 2 further meetings with Kun Thaksin, and one genuinely surreal afternoon where I drove to the car wash behind the Kamala night market and sat outside it for 20 minutes, looking at people getting their vehicles washed, which resolved nothing but felt like something I needed to do. Then I went to Phuket International Airport on a Tuesday morning and took the connection to Bangkok and flew back to Manchester. I want to tell you what I know now, clearly and without the defensiveness that I am aware runs through parts of this account like a wire I cannot remove from the structure. The first thing I know is that a professionally constructed fraudulent investment prospectus is indistinguishable from a real one to someone who does not have independent professional verification. This is not a comforting thing to know, and it does not make me feel less foolish, but it is accurate. The difference between what Cream presented and a legitimate investment document was not visible in the documents themselves. It was visible in the land registry records, the actual company director's identity, the law firm whose letterhead was borrowed without their knowledge or involvement, and the construction site which belonged to a completely different development. None of these things were verifiable by reading the documents. They required independent inquiry. The document verification that Graham had recommended and I had not done would have caught at least 3 of these discrepancies within a week. 1 week, from a local lawyer, at a cost of perhaps £300 to £500, against £163,000. I want that number to sit with you for a moment. The second thing is about the sunk cost mechanism, which I think is underestimated as a vulnerability in these schemes. The additional requests in April and May were not random. They were calibrated. The April request was large enough to be the kind of additional investment a real development might require, but not so large that it felt like a separate decision. It felt like a continuation of the January decision. The May request was smaller still, £22,000 against an existing commitment of £141,000, which made it feel trivially rational in proportion to what was already in place. Each additional payment was designed to be easier to make than to refuse, because refusing meant acknowledging the possibility that the original investment was lost, and I was psychologically incapable of acknowledging that. The scheme was not primarily a fraud on my judgment. It was a fraud on my emotional relationship to the money I had already lost. That is a more sophisticated target and a harder one to defend. The third is this, and I want to say it directly. The most dangerous investor in any scheme is the one who has recently survived a financial loss. Not because they are less intelligent, because they are more motivated. The sunk cost mentality of a man who has already lost something significant makes him willing to commit to things he would otherwise examine more carefully, because examining means risk, and risk means the possibility of another loss, and another loss is the one thing he absolutely cannot face. I was the ideal investor for a scheme like Cream's. I had enough money to be a target, enough desperation to make fast decisions, and enough recent experience of failure to make caution feel like the enemy rather than the protection. If you are reading this from a position of recent financial loss, I am asking you specifically to stop and hear me. The next opportunity you are presented with is the most important one to verify independently, not the least important. Your desperation is an asset to someone who knows how to use it. I am back in Manchester now. The £47,000 is in a savings account. I do work for a hospitality consultancy on a contract basis. 10 years of running a pub turns out to be worth something to companies trying to understand the operational side of the sector, even when the pub itself is gone. I am not rebuilding anything. I am maintaining. That is a different thing, and it has taken me several months to make my peace with the distinction. There is no Thailand Chapter 2. There is no resort, obviously. There is no woman named Cream in any database that Kun Taksin or the Phuket police have been able to find. Paul, the Dutchman from Chiang Mai, sends me a message occasionally. We have a kind of solidarity that is specific to people who have been taken by the same invisible hand and who have found each other in the aftermath. The police investigation is open. It will most likely remain open. The money is gone. At least I did not give her the last 50,000. That is the only version of this story that ends with something that might, if the light is right and you squint a bit, look like winning.